All right, boys and girls, we are back for another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email us, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Debra Soh, who you can follow on Twitter at Dr. Debra Soh. She has a wonderful new book out, which I'm sure is going to prompt a ton of conversation on the end of gender. Dr. Soh, thank you so much for taking the time to join us again.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I know that this had to be something that was a project long in the works, and I have a ton of questions for you about it. But before I begin, just maybe tell our listeners a little bit about what really motivated you to take the plunge and make the kind of statements that you do in this book, which is pretty much the most definitive thing that I've read yet about the myths that animate our conversation about gender today.
Thank you. I would say the number one motivator for me has been all of the questions people have been asking me over the years since I first started writing about the science of gender, and the fact that there is so much misinformation being permeated in our society by not just journalism and the media, but also with government policies, with scientific organizations themselves, medical organizations. And I actually find it really terrifying, the fact that it is so difficult to tell what is legitimate science today and what is not legitimate, because pseudoscience or ideas that are not backed by science are being promoted as though they are actually scientific. So I wrote this book. I have 9 myths, and we go through each of these myths and why they are incorrect. And I offer the scientific research in terms of why it is that, these myths are harmful.
You have this anecdote a little later in the book, but it's one that really stuck out to me about this experience that you had a few years ago, where you went in to listen to a researcher giving a report about something. And they mention in their first slide that at baseline, women's cortisol levels were higher than men's. And someone in the audience asked, "Is this because of the male gaze?" Now, in a scientific sort of world, is there a scientific definition for the male gaze? Is that something that exists in the world of science?
No, that's a purely ideological concept, and I was really disturbed by that. And as I write in the book, I tried to be subtle about it, but I turned and looked quite clearly at who had posed the question, because I was trying to understand where is this coming from. And the thing is, I realized I've left academia. I left 3 years ago, and now I work as a journalist full time. And I realized if I had stayed, I would have had to pretend like everyone else that there was absolutely nothing wrong with that question, and that it was a legitimate question, and that it was appropriate to ask about something like that, which is completely unscientific, at a scientific conference.
I don't want to take your whole turn away from academia down to a single turn to look at who asked a question, but that does seem like a significant moment in your life to kind of confront what changes were going on in academia in a way that I believe should disturb anybody who really cares about science. What were some of the other things that you saw before leaving that world that disturbed you about the way that this ideological conversation is infecting?
The turning point for me was a couple of years earlier, where I was just finishing my PhD, and I had been noticing this trend in mainstream news stories of gender dysphoric children. So these are children who say they were born in the wrong body, and all of the news coverage was saying the best way forward for these children would be to transition at a young age, and their parents would say they're doing so much better now, they're so much happier. But from a scientific perspective, all of the research actually shows that the vast majority of these children are more likely to grow up to be gay in adulthood. They're not going to be transgender. So they grow comfortable in their bodies. And no one was saying this. I mean, I think there were maybe 1 or 2 news stories at the time, or opinion pieces at the time, defending this research. So I wrote an op-ed, and I waited about 6 months to publish it. And I asked my mentors and colleagues for their advice, because I knew that there would be backlash to it. And one conversation in particular that I had with one mentor who's very supportive of me, I asked him, should I wait until I have tenure to have this published? Because at that time I had planned to stay in academia and to go on and have my own research program. And he told me that tenure was not going to protect me. So that was really, as I mentioned, a turning point for me, because I realized I didn't see how I could stay in an environment where I couldn't, as a scientist, even pursue interesting questions, and that you have to live in fear of what you're potentially going to find. And since then, it really has only gotten worse. I do have a chapter in the book talking about how social justice and activism really has no place in academia, and especially not in sexology, which is my former discipline, which is the scientific study of sex and gender. And so I'm really glad I made the decision to leave and become a journalist, because now I do at least have the freedom to speak my mind.
What's the difference between biological sex and gender or gender identity?
Biological sex refers to, well, it's both are binary, I should say. Both are not a spectrum. Both are biologically based and not social constructs. So biological sex is determined by gametes, which are either eggs or sperm. And for 99% of us, our gender identity is our biological sex. So this does not include intersex people and transgender people, but I don't think we need to reconceptualize sex or gender in order to be inclusive to those communities. And I'm all for offering equal rights and protections to those communities. But again, I don't think we need to rewrite our understanding of these fundamental concepts. And so gender identity refers to how we feel in relation to our biological sex. Most of the vast majority of people who are born male are masculine, feel masculine. The same for the vast majority of people who are born female will be feminine and feel female typical.
The scientific aspect of this that I see most frequently on social media and hear occasionally in real life, though less so, always tries to find some way to spin against this frank and pretty simple, straightforward definition that you've given us. What are the most common ways that myth that you talk about in the book takes form?
It started with people saying that gender is a social construct, which it is not. And this, I think your audience probably remember, if they follow this conversation, the Google memo that happened in 2017. James Damore wrote a memo talking about how there are on average differences between the sexes in terms of occupational interests, and this has biological underpinnings. I wrote a column for the Globe and Mail defending his memo. And since then, it's just gone absolutely downhill. It's beyond gender as a social construct. Then it's stretched to gender as a spectrum. And then since then, it's also stretched to encompass biological sex. So all of this is completely nonsense. I can't believe that this has become mainstream in terms of, as you mentioned, people will cite this as though this is factual. And it's just taken for granted now, but it's absolutely incorrect.
What is the underlying reason for that? Because I think for a lot of people who existed outside the world of different areas of academia, this was a conversation that seemed to happen and be over and agreed to in very rapid form, in the sense that lots of people, I think, got a bit of whiplash from it. What was the underlying element that came forward to push that spectrum idea into the mainstream so quickly?
I think a lot of it is people who mean well in terms of the general public who accept this at face value and don't challenge it, even though it doesn't quite sound right to them. I think they feel that in the name of, say, gender equality or promoting acceptance of marginalized groups or people of minority status in terms of their gender identity, that self-identification is the most important thing and that we shouldn't challenge that. And I think it's also coming from a place of, in the past, there has been discrimination against gay people. And I do still think homophobia is an issue in society, but I think it's gotten better and people have come around. And I think with that has come a realization that we made a mistake. And so now people are going so far in the completely opposite direction that anything goes in terms of identity, in terms of gender, and people feel that it's hateful to question somebody for how they identify.
The aspect of this that I find so odd in this moment is how gender and the biological associations with sex that we hear about has to be viewed through this rainbow, this spectrum, etc., at the same time that people are taking much harder definition toward the limits of race, which to me just seems very counterintuitive and doesn't involve the circuitous and multifaceted aspect of ethnic history that we all have. Why do you think that sort of one aspect of this is exploding into a spectrum of openness, and the other is saying, no, you have to check one of these boxes. You have to be one of these things.
I think the reason so with the term transgender, even that the definition of transgender has expanded in the last few years to encompass many more things beyond someone who identifies as the opposite sex. So previously, transgender referred to someone who wanted to transition to live as the opposite sex, which is binary still. So it's within a gender binary.
Mm-hmm.
And then the definition of transgender now has expanded to include also people who identify as a third gender, who, for people who have transitioned to the opposite sex, will say these people don't have anything in common with me, because it's a very different presentation, it's a very different underlying way of thinking. And then on top of it, it's now also expanded to people who are just gender non-conforming. So if I as a woman want to wear men's clothing, suddenly that makes me part of the transgender umbrella, which I think is coming from a place of wanting to increase the prevalence so that acceptance is, in their minds, more justifiable. And I don't think you have to do that to advocate for acceptance of people who are trans or people who are different in any way. And I think with race, I think because it's, I think part of it is the mandates of the movement are slightly different. My sense is that there's a very specific narrative that has to be put forth. And of course, I'm against racism. I think we all are, or should be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a very specific narrative that's being put forth. And so they are trying to minimize the number of people who are allowed to speak or to potentially challenge that narrative. Because you do see people who check the right, quote unquote, right box in terms of racial identity, but they are also told that their opinions don't count.
Exactly. You write in the book, it's, as you just said, it's more outdated to assume that someone who is gender atypical is another category of gender entirely than to consider them as part of the normal variation you'd expect within female or male, just like any other human trait. Gender is not a continuum or a rainbow or a diverse spectrum. It does seem to me to be such an outdated form of view. And at least when I was growing up, it was framed as an outdated point of view, within movies and pop culture and interaction with other people, to say, oh, well, because you are this, that means you can't do X, Y, or Z. And that, to me, even, in the context of your sexual orientation, was something that still existed within the binary. Why did we cross a line into saying that for a male doing feminine things or for a female doing things that were viewed as more masculine, that meant that they had to be assigned a different position on this spectrum versus just different people like different things?
I think that's one of the faults of really radical far left thinking. And I would still consider myself to be a liberal. I'm definitely not far left. And I'm really somewhat horrified, I think, at the way things have turned, because those people on the fringes do not speak for most liberals. And so I think it's this idea of wanting to constantly change things and redefine things, because that gives a particular group or a particular ideology power. But as you're saying, I think it's really ridiculous. Why is it that a woman who is even slightly masculine or wants to wear men's clothing is now considered a man, or is considered another gender? And the same thing with feminine men. So I should say, I do support with trans adults. I think trans adults should be supported in transitioning. And I do think if it's the right decision for someone, then we should support that. But in many cases, especially with, say, the non-binary movement, we say with a lot of individuals, when you actually sit and listen to them speak, for people who are born female, I think a lot of it is that and I have been critical of feminism in the past, but I do think they've experienced sexism in their life, and they decide they're going to have an easier life just not being a woman. And for feminine men, it's the same thing. Or for individuals who are gay, whether they're born male or female, instead of identifying as gay and having to deal with some of the discrimination that comes with that, saying, well, if I'm this new thing, people will love and accept me because that's what's trendy now.
You used a key word in there, and that word was adult. I think a lot of the points at which people started waking up and paying attention to this and viewing it not as some discussion that was confined to elite levels or academia or big cities and the like, was when this started to become an issue that they had to care about related to their children. When you started to see lawsuits, for instance, between divorced couples, where one parent was saying that the child was going to transition and should get drugs injected at an early age, or have to accept some round of medication to help them do so, and you have splits over minor children and the like. It gets very messy very quickly. and attracts, obviously, attention from media and the like. What do you think about the conversation as it relates to the way that children are treated, and technically, from a lot of different perspectives, forced into a box pretty early on, it seems, in terms of determining what the rest of their life is going to look like, with a lot of potential negative ramifications?
Right. I really am critical of this early transitioning movement. One, because it's not scientific, it's not backed by good clinical practice. And also, I think it really is using these children as pawns to further an agenda that really only benefits adults.
Mm.
So, I mean, as I said, with adults, you have cognitive maturity to make these decisions about your life. It's not appropriate to then look at children and say, these children were like me as a child, and so we should help them, because again, those children are not yours. They're not your children, number one. They are not you, and so it's wholly inappropriate. And so I think part of it is that if this is something that becomes accepted and widespread in children, part of that comes a normalization or an acceptance from society that this is, quote unquote, I guess, natural.
Mhm.
Right. And I don't think that has to be the case to advocate for acceptance of trans people. But I think on some level, whether it's intentional or it's just an underlying subconscious drive for these individuals, they very much, I think that's part of it, because this is a serious part of the conversation that's really being pushed.
It's you have a line in your book. It isn't sexist to acknowledge sex differences. What's sexist is assuming that women must be the same as men in order to be treated as equals. Explain that for us a little bit.
Absolutely. Because I think, and I write in the book how I used to be very, very feminist. I still am in favor of equality between men and women, but I feel the feminist movement really is not about equality anymore. It's really about saying to women, you must be like men, among science, other things like science denial, and I think in some cases being, again, anti-men. But saying to women that if you are, quote unquote, empowered or independent, that you must be like men, and if you are not, you are oppressed, and this is due to sexism. And I think it's really infantilizing of women to say that we can't make our own decisions, and that if a woman is female typical, that in some way there's something wrong with her. I think the conversation should be women and men should be accepted as they are, whether they are gender typical or otherwise. And just as much as it was as bad to say that a woman should be relegated to certain gender typical roles, I think it's just as harmful to say that she must be gender atypical in order to be considered enlightened.
Mhm. In terms of the science of this, uh, I'm sure that there are arguments on the other side too, and that they try to twist this in different ways. But what do we know, and what are some of the big things that stick out to you about the differences between men's and women's brains? You talk about how you deal with people who feel like the changes in our brains that happen scientifically, that they stop at the neck. Tell us a little bit about why that's not the case.
Yeah, I call that neurocreationism, because it doesn't make sense. Why it is that the people will, so the people who say that gender is a social construct and that there are no biologically based sex differences in the brain will say, yes, of course, there are physical differences between men and women. There are differences in terms of secondary sex characteristics. But for some reason, the organ that is responsible for programming these differences is supposed to be the same and completely unaffected between the sexes. It doesn't make any sense at all. And what's scary is that this is actually being promoted in the scientific literature. So we have new studies coming out that are saying that there are no differences between men and women's brains, or that parts of the brain that have previously been shown to be sexually dimorphic or different between men and women are actually not different after all. And so I think to myself, this is, especially when it comes to brain imaging research, it's so expensive. Like, these studies can cost upwards of tens of thousands of dollars. And even if you show that every part of the brain is identical between men and women, that's not going to change people who hold sexist views. So I really think it's a complete waste of time and money.
Mhm. The arguments that they advance about sameness, what are the problems and some of the aspects where that argument fails that you see crop up in studies?
Well, there was a big, I mean, there's still a hoopla around the idea that the fact that we don't have a 50-50 ratio of women in STEM is due to sexism. And so all of these initiatives are being put forth to help encourage women to go into STEM. And I think the only way we're really going to have a 50-50 ratio is if we are forcing women to go into these disciplines that they may not necessarily find as interesting, because the scientific literature does support that on average, there are differences between men and women in terms of what they find interesting in terms of occupational preference, as I mentioned. And so I think as long as men and women are pursuing what they find meaningful in life, I don't think there should be any problem with that. And we see in cultures where there is very high gender equity, so countries like Norway and Denmark, these differences in occupational preference actually widen. So it's just really strange and absurd to me to see people who are, again, advocating for gender as a social construct. They will really go to any length to defend this argument, and they will say, you know, this is a worldwide, global, I guess, the effects of patriarchy, and it's just completely nonsensical.
Yeah, I'm going to quote you back at you again. You write, cross-cultural research offers even more evidence that the smaller number of women in STEM is due to women's own choices as opposed to sexism. Cultures with greater gender equity have larger sex differences in occupational preferences because in these societies, people are free to choose their jobs based on what they enjoy as opposed to what's merely available to them. To me, it's all fine to be in favor of, oh, we want to promote, women in STEM and having more girls who go into STEM. I think that's a perfectly fine thing. But I also don't think that that can be assigned to some type of larger conspiracy about what women want to do or something along those lines, when we have this evidence that shows pretty clearly what people do when they have the choice made up to them. Why is it that that doesn't crack through and we continue to hear this mythology about, oh, well, there are no differences there between the brains?
I think, I can't speak for the people who are pushing this agenda, but I would imagine for some of them, I'm sure they have experienced sexism in their lives. I mean, I've experienced sexism too. I experienced sexism when I was in the sciences, but again, it's not something that's going to impede you. And I think if you do want to succeed, regardless of your field as a woman, you can do so. If you're focused, I think you can choose what will motivate you and hold you back in life. So I think that's the more important message to be had. But in terms of why it continues, I think it's because, well, we do have we have actual scientists who are saying this is a problem, which is why it's so, again, ridiculous to me, because I think people are sympathetic and they see that, and they say, especially, I speak to a number of male colleagues who are very sympathetic and they're very rational people. I think they feel that, they have daughters, or, obviously they have wives and mothers, or they know women, and they just feel like that's the right thing to do, is to be sympathetic to us. But, something like when you have initiatives where institutions are giving women extra points on test scores to help them get into STEM, I mean, I think that's really harmful, because it says that women are not capable of getting there on their own. And then for those women who do go into those programs, how are they going to be treated when their male counterparts are aware of the fact that they were given extra points to be there? I don't think that helps. If anything, I think it makes it worse.
I'm sure that you have opinions about it, but what has been your reaction to the controversy that has played out in recent months from J.K. Rowling and her frequent and very public statements on a lot of these matters?
I think she was very reasonable about it. I mean, I read her tweets, I read the statement that she put out, and I thought it was very sensitively worded. But I also think there's such a disconnect between someone's intentions. I don't know her, so I don't know what her intentions are. But from what I took from the way she approached it, was that she is in favor of transgender rights, but she's also saying there are certain things here that we need to be talking about. And that nuance is completely lost. And I do find that in my work too. And I think for anyone who finds themselves in a situation where they are trying to point out, there are certain points here that there is a distinction that needs to be made, say in terms of women who are transgender and women who are born women. And I don't think it should be considered hateful to do so. But I think for many people, especially if they're either very much invested in this narrative or in activism, or if they think this is the right way to think, if you say anything like that, they think that you are a horrible bigot.
Your friend in academia who said that you wouldn't be protected by tenure. I certainly think that they were right, but that has to give one pause when they put out a book like this in terms of what you'll be able to do and the conversations you'll be able to have. Why did you think this was important enough that you needed to make such a significant statement about it? Given the conversations that we're having, it seems like a very difficult time to take such a stand.
I think it's partially, for me, my personality. Just I've always been very outspoken, and I've always felt like I can't expect anyone else to speak up if I'm not willing to. So especially with these issues with the children, most of my colleagues who are still in academia or are working with these populations, they can't say the things I say, even though it is backed by science, because their jobs are at risk. They're fearful for the damage that's going to be done to their personal reputation. They're afraid of mobs that are going to attack them on social media and potentially go after their loved ones. For me, I've been through so many mobbings by this point. It really doesn't affect me as much anymore. So I think that's part of it. And I just feel like we're reaching a point where it's gotten so much worse in the last few years. I really didn't think it was ever going to get this bad in terms of the extent to which gender ideology has really infected every aspect of life. It doesn't matter what field you work in. You know, your kids are now being taught this in school, so it's affecting the next generation. It's impossible to get away from. And I feel the despair that some people have when they reach out to me, in the sense that the world doesn't make sense to them. They don't know why this is happening, and they don't know what they can do. And they also don't have the resources to fight back against it. I had one colleague actually who reached out to me and said, my kids are being taught this in school, that there are infinite genders, and they're showing me these quote unquote studies that back this up, and I don't know, what can I do? I can't argue because they have the quote unquote research on their side. So that really, you know, made me sad to hear that. And so this book really was motivated by that, to say to anyone who is skeptical, you don't have to take my word for it. You can read the book and read the studies yourself and come to your own decision.
Obviously, in the context of the Harper's letter, which didn't talk about trans issues, just because of the stances of some of the signers, it was being referred to as an anti-trans document, or something that was taking a stance on things that were not even in it. That's the degree to which it seems to have infected this conversation. I know that there's a lot of argument today about liberalism versus illiberalism. The Harper's letter warned, obviously, mostly about a right authoritarian structure. But to me, I'm far more worried about what I see from a kind of totalitarian, very loud left that really does want to go after anybody for either misgendering, or for taking what they view as the wrong stance, or one that they find inconvenient to them, and that extends far beyond the realm of people who are within media, who have platforms to give their opinions, and extends all the way down to people who just are trying to live and work within society outside the realm of any of this discussion. What do you say to people who are in that position, who worry that they're on pins and needles, that they are the people who live and work in New York City, for instance, who might be concerned about a complaint against them for not using the correct pronoun or preferred definition out of some lengthy list that they're certainly not going to memorize?
I have always said for people to speak out as much as they can, even in small ways. And I can understand it's really difficult, especially if you are in a workplace that very much frowns on that and your livelihood is potentially at stake. I think even if you can't do it at work, in your personal life, I find it makes such a difference to even have people in your personal circle who support you for who you are and what you truly think. Because it's one thing to have to go to work and have to keep your game face on, but then to have to do that in your personal life too, I think can be pretty exhausting. I mean, in terms of my life, I'm very lucky in that all the people close to me are very supportive of me, and they know who I really am. So I think that's helped me too, regarding your earlier question. But I also joke, and I think there's some truth to it, that it's only a matter of time before we are all canceled.
Yes.
And at the rate we're going at, it's over such minuscule, ridiculous, pointless things at this point. And I think most people are becoming very skeptical of cancel culture. And when they hear that someone's getting canceled, they're saying, is this really justified? Like, what did this person actually do? And should this have happened to them? So take some solace in that, I suppose.
There was a figure on a show I've never watched yesterday, coming out apologizing. Someone from the show Dance Moms, who is still a teenager, apologized for things that she apparently laughed at on social media when she was 9 years old. So that's the rate that we're going at, Deborah.
It's terrible. There were a couple of weeks where I was going on social media, and it quite literally every day there are two new people or three more people getting canceled. And I'm thinking, what have these people done? And I can't even remember who got canceled last week at this point. So we're all going to forget.
You wake up, you see what's trending, and you very quickly say, okay, either that person's canceled, or or something, or it's their birthday, or whatever. When you're talking about this, I know that it's somewhat hampering to promote a book during virus times. When you're talking about this, what is the kind of feedback that you're getting from outside the academic community, from just people who have been interested in your writing, they may not even have your book yet, but who correspond with you and just are grateful for what you're saying and wishing that they could say it as well?
Well, the book came out yesterday, and I was actually really, really amazed, and just it means so much to hear people saying to me, "This is so reasonable. I'm so glad you wrote this book." Some people have told me they've already finished it in a day, which I don't know how that's humanly possible.
It
But
goes quick. I got through it in it's about 2 days, I guess.
thank you. I appreciate that you took the time to read it. I mean, it's my biggest thing was I wanted it to be something that was accessible to people and that it would be interesting too, because I think sometimes the scientific literature can be very dry. And so that also can be another roadblock in terms of trying to understand this conversation. Not only is the jargon difficult and there's a paywall to get to these studies, but then, you're reading it and you're thinking, oh my God, this is going to take me 3 hours. So I did try to make it as accessible as possible. And I also wanted it to be family friendly. So I should say, there's no cursing. Any reference to sex is very anatomical, very clinical. So it is appropriate for children. I wanted it to be something that parents could also give their kids if they wanted to give them some additional reading material, or you can listen to the audiobook in the car.
That's a good point. I hadn't actually noticed that, but now that I think about it, no, that makes total sense.
Mm-hmm.
The one aspect actually of that comes up. Talk to me a little bit about the differences in parenting, and how we hear discussions about the differences between the sexes in a lot of different contexts, but I think that parenting is one of those areas in which, again, people try to have an attitude like, to talk about what, say, a father brings to the relationship is a negative on single moms. From my perspective, that's not actually fair. What you're really just talking about is that, a father can bring different things to a child's life than mom can alone, and vice versa. Tell me a little bit about that.
In terms of, say, the benefits of having a mother versus a father?
Well, just what you view as being any of the differences in benefiting a child that come out of something like that, or is that something that's just not really as much part of your research?
I would say, I do have a chapter about gender neutral parenting and
Yes.
about how I just think children should be loved and accepted unconditionally, regardless of whether they're gender typical or atypical. And, we have this trend now of parents who are raising their children as a third gender. So the Thabies, that was a popular thing 2 years ago. And now there are children who are literally identifying as non-binary. So they will use they, them pronouns. And I think that's very confusing for the child, especially from a developmental perspective, because children don't understand gender. It's not until about the age of 7 that they fully understand that gender is something that is permanent and doesn't change based on the clothes you put on or your haircut. So
tell me just a little bit about what those children are likely to experience. Obviously, this is early in this process, but I said earlier that I feel like making these determinations, especially if you start drug protocols or anything along those lines to try to make this more physically permanent, that what we're really doing is short-circuiting the ability of a child to make determinations for themselves in terms of how they want to live in the future. What do you think, or what kind of research can be done to find out a little bit more about what those children are going through? Because I have to think that there are a lot of challenges.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, I think those kids, whatever, it goes back to the biology and hormonal exposure in the womb in terms of what they're going to find interesting and what they're going to gravitate toward and their behavior and regarding whether they are gender typical or atypical. Because my sense is the parents are raising them as a third gender because they want to avoid gender stereotypes. So I think that's fine. Just do that. You don't need your child to be a third gender. You can just let them do what they want. So in terms of the research that can be done, the body of research that currently exists is very strong. And you can see that within infants that are 2 days old, the boys tend to, on average, prefer looking at mechanical mobiles, and the females prefer looking at faces. So this is not something that, you have some people who will actually argue that these preferences in 2-day-old babies is due to them being socialized out of the womb. So that's where we are in this conversation. And I think this conversation is going to continue because they're going to continue to argue about that. Even though, again, there was one paper I cited that came out of UCLA showing the brain, there are sex differences in the brain before it's finished developing in utero. So I would not be surprised when they start to argue that it's because, I guess the cells are learning gender stereotypes also.
They're absorbing it by osmosis.
Yeah.
The aspect of this that relates back to academic freedom, it seems to me that it's going to become increasingly difficult to do that type of research that I'm talking about going forward, because it will run afoul of the assumptions of departments and of political correctness, that the left is not going to want to have anyone entertain the idea that there could be any negative consequences coming out of the experiences of these kids. Do you worry about that?
Absolutely. And I see that with new research that has come out since I've left academia. There have been studies that have been pulled if they anger trans activists. And so really what we see going forward is that the only research that is going to come out is research that has basically been given the stamp of approval by activists, whether explicitly or otherwise. And that's worrisome because, the public, I think that really does a disservice and damages public trust in science. And also it's used now as a very strategic tool of manipulation to say, okay, well, we can say that this is the best way forward for these kids or whatever the argument is, but now once the so-called scientific research supports it, then it adds even more support to it. So I don't doubt there are going to be more studies coming out saying that this is the best for these children, or that non-binary is a legitimate thing. I think it's fine to identify however you want, but it's just not backed by science. And so it's a really troubling time that we're in.
The situation in terms of American tensions right now couldn't be higher in different areas, both about the economy, related to attitudes towards race, related to attitudes towards gender. I wonder if, as someone who got into this field because of a lot of different reasons, but perhaps not anticipating the level of controversy that would surround it today, do you have hope and optimism for the future? You close your book by asking people to kind of take a breath and step back and reevaluate why we think things. Do you think that that's possible? Do you think that this is a period of time that we'll look back on as potentially being pretty silly, the way that we fought about these aspects?
I do. And I think overall, I feel this conversation, I've been quite gloom and doom, but I am a pretty optimistic person, actually. And I do think most people are not on board with this stuff, and I think the response to my book speaks to that. I really thought that across the board, people were going to tell me I was a bad person, but the response has been overall quite positive. I mean, we'll see, give it a bit more time, but I think most people are not on board. And it's really just a very, very vocal minority of people who've taken it upon themselves to speak about these issues, and they are also being given platforms and very large audiences and being promoted as though they are speaking for the science. But I think at the end of the day, the truth always comes out, and people will see that, and we'll look back on this, and I'm just hoping that we'll be able to continue on without too much in terms of negative repercussions.
So people can find The End of Gender on Amazon.com, wherever books are sold. They can also find out more about you at your website, drdeborahsoh.com, and follow you on Twitter at Dr. Debra Soh. That's SOH. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today, Deborah. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much, Ben.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.